Our first speaker in the second half will be Dr. Irena Kossowska, who comes to us from Copernicus University in Toruń, where she is a professor. I think if you've ever tried to learn anything about Polish modernism, you have read what she has written. She has published an amazing amount of articles and books, especially on Młoda Polska and the young Poland, and more recently about the interwar period. Her scholarship is really quite remarkable, so I'm very excited that she is able to be here with us and speak to us and give us some insight into the incredible world of Witold Wojtkiewicz. So without further ado, Dr. Kossowska.
Hello. At the very beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to participate in this seminar. And in terms of the geocultural span of symbolism, long-awaited debate. I would also like to apologize for slightly extending the topic of my paper by adding material concerning Bruno Schulz, of course comparing to the initial proposal. I consider this modification a reasonable solution because it provides a broader context to the puppet paradigm we will be talking about, the puppet paradigm in the visual arts. And since Schulz's work dates back to the 1920s and early 1930s, we will still remain within the chronological framework of the conference. So the mannequin, the marionette, and the doll, these motifs gained momentum in European culture of the 1920s and 1930s. The denotation of these figures embraced diverse, sometimes even antithetical concepts. Their functions and roles were interpreted as an exemplification of civilizational progress on the one hand, and as an expression of the decadence of the modern world on the other. The birth of the new man idiom was proclaimed by numerous avant-garde factions harboring utopian ambitions to establish a universal socio-political order. The counter-paradigm of the man enslaved by technological progress was recognized by the supporters of the restitution of the political and ethical order destroyed by the Great War. The year 1925 saw the publication of Oskar Schlemmer's Die Bühne im Bauhaus, in which he presented the mannequin and the robot as models of a contemporary actor. Concurrently, testifying to the oppression of the socio-political system of the Weimar Republic, the objectified man became an attractive motive for the protagonists of Neue Sachlichkeit. Furthermore, the paradigm of a human puppet captured the imagination of Bruno Schulz, inhabitant of the provincial town of Drohobycz, eastern Galicia in the interwar Poland, now Ukraine, and the author of the treatise on mannequins, published in 1934, as well as the imagination of his friend, Deborah Fogel, a philosopher from Lviv, who authored the novel Acacias Blien, The Acacias Are in Bloom, which came out in 1935. There is no individual hero in this book, this is a quotation from Schulz, but an anonymous crowd of dolls, mannequins exhibited at the hairdressers, passers-by in Steve bowler hats, manicurists and waiters who are lost and entangled in the city mechanism of walking the streets, faceless and de-individualized figures. This aspect of a human being reduced to the rank of a pawn, a mechanical figure, a knob wearing a bowler hat, is what the author shares with the constructivist vision of the world imposed by the modern visual arts, wrote Bruno Schulz in his review of Deborah Fogel's book, whereas she noticed the affinity between Schulz's poetics and the work of Georg Gross. Let us follow her associations. Gross paintings from the years from 1919 to 1921 feature mannequins deprived of facial features demonstrating their prosthetic limbs, revealing the steering mechanisms in the cracks of their artificial shell, and walking the streets in which geometric buildings show no sign of being inhabited. The artist provided these soulless creatures with numbers instead of names, thus deepening the sense of anonymity and alienation born in the maze of a modern metropolis. Gross adopted the human puppet motif from the metaphysical paintings of Carlo Carrà and Giorgio de Chirico. Therefore, his art directs our attention to the creator of the mannequin paradigm, Giorgio de Chirico. Developed by de Chirico in the period of 1909 to 1919, the Pittura Metaphysica aesthetics was several years ahead of Schultz's literary and drawing narratives. Nevertheless, it is the mannequin paradigm that allows us to juxtapose the works of Schultz and de Chirico at an intertextual level, even though the genesis of the dummy motif is different in both cases. Schultz animated a dressmaker's mannequin, transforming it into a marionette with a human shell. In de Chirico's metaphysical paintings, it is an ancient statue, or rather a contemporary copy thereof, that transformed into a mannequin, a simulacrum made of shoddy material, an empty form devoid of archetypal meaning, and a substitute of cult object without real denotation. Still, both Schultz and de Chirico gave this new objectified version of man a similar status of an ostensible entity and a similar function of an actor in the illusory theater of the world, as well as a role of a false cult object. De Chirico had his favorite masters whose works he paraphrased and adapted for his own purposes. The artist's reservoir of tropes referred to the art of Max Klinger and Arnold Böcklin, from whom he learned to relieve the reverence for the ancient tradition of pompous tones. Schultz, who paraphrased numerous components of the museum art while searching for traces of the primordial myth scattered in cultural layers, also had ancestors in symbolism. The myth of special significance for the artist was the theory of gender's antinomy, the concept of demonic woman destroying the man in the name of preserving the continuity of humankind, formulated by Stanisław Przybyszewski, who modeled his assumptions on the fatalistic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Reflected in a distorting mirror, the femme fatale topos became the leitmotif of Schultz's oeuvre, comprising drawings, prints, and prose. A series of 28 cliché vers depicting in various variants the motif of homage paid to a female idol by a man dwarfed in his humiliation, the bouquet of idolatry, was a reinterpretation of the symbolist topic of satanic woman. Although Schultz could not fully free himself from erotic phobias and obsessions, he abated the dramatic tension of his affections with irony and weakened the gravity of the cult of femininity he confessed. Stigmatized with ugliness, and the grotesque men in Schultz's drawings and prints crawl and humble themselves at the feet of feminine deities who are haughty and indifferent to the gestures of reverence or ready to punish the flattering dwarfs cruelly. However, these followers of the religion that absolutizes the woman, who carry the image of her shoe on banners in crowded processions, derive perverse satisfaction from their humiliation and experience ecstatic pleasure when offended. Their psychological profile is simplified, and the scope of expressive capability is considerably limited. In subsequent scenes, they play the same roles and twist their faces in the same grimaces of suffering or delight. With her variable but narrow register of psychological features, the female idol also seems to be objectified. As a matter of fact, the ideal woman is a dummy of oakum, a mannequin, a lady of oakum and canvas, a makeshift product that pretends to be human. Another character to be found in Schulz's compositions, such as Bacchanalia and The Rite of Spring, is a Pierrot stuffed with sawdust, the representative of all those jesting golems, all effigies which brood tragically over their comic grimaces. As if in a self-referential manner, the Pierrot's figure connotes the conventionality of art. Created by Schulz, the reality that runs parallel to the everyday experience reveals the bond between the artist and the sub-trend of symbolism, of which Witold Wojtkiewicz was representative. The tone of artificiality, the fictitiousness of the imagery, and the intricacies of symbolic associations became intensified in Wojtkiewicz's work owing to masked comedians, clowns, and Pierrots, motionless and overwhelmed with their own thoughts. Sharing common destiny, the clowns focus intently on the affections suppressed under the frozen grimace of a jester's mask. Moreover, the actors are accompanied by marionettes, the latter being more vital than the former and being an inverted embodiment of human feelings. Wojtkiewicz adopted the concept of doll animation from the marionette theory of Heinrich von Kleist and for the reformist theatrical concepts of Maurice Maeterlinck. It is the marionettes in his paintings that fight tournament duels, dance, locked in embrace, and gesticulate wildly before the surprised eyes of unmoving viewers. The stories told, dramas, melodramas, and farces are suspended between the reality of everyday experience and the space of imagination, and lose their narrative dynamics by becoming transformed into signs of mood. A contrasting combination of a human figure and a puppet is conveyed in the painting Dolls, in which the arbitrary division of the compositional plane reveals the separateness of two worlds, the reality of a bourgeois salon where women sit motionlessly as if overwhelmed with boredom, and an artificially created reality in which rag dolls gesticulate ecstatically, succumbing to the dynamics of dance. This confrontation of objectified women and puppets animated at the artist's will makes us realize the drama of human being trapped in social conventions. Apart from depicting the inversion between the real existence of man and the artificial being of a doll, Wojtkiewicz's work anticipated Schulz's imagery with an ironic perception of the idea of pan-eroticism anchored in Schopenhauer's philosophy of Geschlechtsstreit. Created in the period of 1903 till 1904, Wojtkiewicz's drawings, collectively referred to as tragicomic sketches, evoke an entanglement of tragedy with irony and saturate the existential drama with elements of humor and grotesque deformation, being a counter-reaction to the metaphysics of sex propounded by Stanisław Przybyszewski. Having arrived in Krakow in 1898, Przybyszewski instilled in the artistic bohemia the basic thesis of Schopenhauer's philosophy that subordinated human existence to the power of all-encompassing sexual instincts. Tragicomic sketches testified to the incipient process of re-evaluation of the conceptual models of the proto-expressionist trend. In the drawings Romantics and Three Generations, Wojtkiewicz toned down the tragedy of the omnipotence of instincts, clashing its metaphysical dimension with purely physiological conditions. A parody of the femme fatale motif is depicted in the drawing Fallen Woman, The Wanton. The fate of the main protagonist of the scene materializes in the shape of a winding way of life connoting Milky Way, strewn with roses offered by clients. After 1905, Wojtkiewicz concentrated on the child psyche, which he perceived as a reflection of emotional conflicts and tensions governing the world of adults. In his depictions of children, the artist created a mirror image between the child's age and elderly age, introducing in his works the figures of senile children and childish old men. Typical of his mature work, this topic is announced in the watercolor Old Man with Child, which exemplify the symbiosis of these two extremes of human existence. The grotesque representation of a little girl becomes ambiguous as it resembles a doll and at the same time reveals her perverse nature. The way in which the artist perceived children in his surroundings to pictorially transform their appearances is best described in a fragment of a letter written to Elisa Parańska from Paris. As an observer of everyday episodes in the Luxembourg Gardens, Wojtkiewicz noted, quote, "I see crowds of children playing like nowhere in the world, particularly girls, skillful little women who are almost tired of life at the age of 10 or 12, and who glance alternately at adult men and the ball, to live without regret and fear that any Saint Anthony can be moved to tears by their premature adulthood," end of quote. The motive of the erotic initiation of children was further elaborated on in the watercolor Spring Breezes. Spring gusts dematerialize the children's silhouettes, transform girls into fleeting apparitions tangled up in their skirts and ribbons, thus changing them into an elusive object of desire. Simultaneously, this artistic parable of psychic tension resulting from unfulfilled temptation is colored with a hint of irony. Wojtkiewicz's drawing of a pensive boy staring at his toys in a cramped pictorial space irresistibly brings to mind one of the emblematic works of early Polish modernism, Spring, of Wojciech Weiss. In his painting, Weiss portrayed the flexed, motionless body as a model against the background of a meadow, thus evocatively depicting his enchantment with the sounds of budding spring and creating a metaphor of erotic initiation. Wojtkiewicz replaced the tempting voice of nature with an equally irresistible fascination with the world of children's puppets, an artificial reality in which the boy's imagination became imprisoned. It is an anticipation of what will dominate the artist's mature works. The domain of a child's experiences, sorrows, and dreams, the world of which toys are an essential determinant, will become the field of ever-deepened psychological penetration for Wojtkiewicz. Analyzing persistently the human psyche in the series Monomania, Madness, Wojtkiewicz entered the sphere of abnormality. Separated with a high wall, a fragment of the hospital garden where deranged patients float about, it becomes a metaphor of suffering that is an inseparable part of the human condition as depicted in a straw in a carriage, madness, and pathos. The maniacs showed in Madness, the circus of madmen, embody existential fears and obsessions that are not falsified by social conventions. Closed in their own hermetic world and imprisoned on rolling platforms, the madmen include grotesquely deformed figures of eminent symbolists, Jacek Malczewski and Ksawery Dunikowski. Dunikowski in the foreground and Malczewski on a wooden horse toy in the middle ground. Thus, Wojtkiewicz ironically identified the world of artistic fiction with the compelling reality of madness and persistent obsession. In the composition Pathos, a huddled naked figure with unrecognizable features sits on the hospital wall, resembling the image of a mourner borrowed from medieval art or an incarnation of fear that paralyzes the patient standing in the foreground. In the painting Fantasy, the triad of brick red, browns, and black sounds painful in the claustrophobic space of the garden, from which The illusory escape route leads through a narrow gate to another closed space of the hospital premises. The passage seems to be guarded by the figure of a maniac who obstinately chews plants as haggard as patients wandering among them. Gradually, Wojtkiewicz transformed the madmen, isolated in the world of their own delusions, into representatives of the fictitious world of art, clowns and pierrots. In the watercolor Rocking Horses, a puppet pushes a toy carriage with great difficulty, while the clown lightly lifts up the rocking horses harnessed to the vehicle. The jester and his helper are being watched from the backstage by the members of the circus troupe, representatives of the world of semi-artistic fiction, frozen in anticipation of how the action will develop. In the painting Melancholy, the compositional frame has been extended to encompass a fragment of the crowded auditorium. Thus, the act of pantomime unfolding on stage draws the attention of observers belonging to three different ontological orders: the real world, the world of art, and the intermediary sphere determined by the circus arena. Developing the poetics of the grotesque, Wojtkiewicz transformed a fairground scene presented in the painting in front of a theater, circus, into a magical theater of imagination. The scene depicting a clown unveiling a curtain serves as a metaphor of the act of artistic creation. However, the world of jesters and puppets suspended among paper garlands coexist in the pictorial space with the empirical reality defined by a dense crowd of spectators. This magical atmosphere is evoked by comedians' masks that are more expressive than onlookers' apathetic faces. Wojtkiewicz seems to reverse the established order of things. He gives primacy to the dimension of art over the everyday experience. In the series of paintings titled Children's Poses, the narrative is focused on the passionate relationship between a princess and her suitor, their heartbreaks, farewells, escapes, and jumps into a void. The fictitiousness of these scenes is intensified by a wooden horse, an accomplice in kidnappings, and a participant of processions. Crowning Wojtkiewicz's work in 1909, but left unfinished due to the artist's terminal illness, the series Ceremonies best exemplifies the artist's idiosyncratic poetics inspired by French Parnassianism and English aestheticism, and reflects his comprehension of sublime beauty and metaphorically potent decorativeness, his sense of erotic undertones and latent perversion, as well as an ironic distance to the mundane world. Translated and promoted by Zenon Przybyszewski, Maurice Maeterlinck's works Les Sept Princesses, La Princesse Malène, and Serre Chaude played a significant role in the shaping of Wojtkiewicz's symbolist attitude. The artist drew equally strongly upon the works of Marcel Schwab, a French writer related to Belgian symbolism. His imagination was also influenced by the fairy tales of Oscar Wilde, saturated with decadent pessimism. Specific to Wojtkiewicz's mature work, the symbiosis of irony, grotesque, and lyricism reappears in the ink drawing, Self-Portrait, a Pierrot in an Armchair, executed shortly before the artist's death. Wojtkiewicz identified himself with a handcuffed, helpless clown at whose feet a bomb in the shape of a distorted heart is about to explode. Pan-irony and pan-masquerade, a world turned inside out, Wojtkiewicz mastered this means of expression to perfection to alleviate the fear of the incomprehensible and to ease existential despair. To reach that goal, the concept of a doll proved to be very useful. In the 1920s, the mannequin idiom reoccurred distinctively in the prints and drawings and prose of Bruno Schulz, whom his first monographer, Arthur Sandauer, categorized as a late symbolist. In Schulz's imagery, again, the dummy appeared suitable for emphasizing the fictitiousness of art and the parodic vein of the artist's idiosyncratic perception of reality. Thank you.
Our last speaker in this mini second version of this panel is Inessa Kouteinikova, who is an independent scholar based in Amsterdam. For me, her scholarship is most familiar with her work on Russian Orientalism, especially in the realm of painting and photography, which has been quite formative for me. But she's also published and curated an array of other topics, including Cold War modern and fashion. But here today she'll talk about something completely different and a hopefully new and refreshing perspective on a well-known Estonian artist. So without further ado.
I want to say thank you to Kumu and to all the organizers for this conference, and also for giving me the opportunity to present this research in process. Well, unlike most of the scholars who've been presenting their work here, I'm very new to Natalie Mei, and was very captivated by her work. She remains quite an unknown figure in Estonian arts, quite surprisingly. Her public veneer is much more exposed, and she lived a very long life, worked as a professor at the Art Academy here and at the Estonian Theatre. But her formative years, which I want to present, really between World War I and early 1920s, remain obscure. Natalie Mei went for the authentic. Two walking female figures with round faces and hollow eyes, one with hands folded on her chest, and the haunted, empty face of a mother neglecting her son. The melancholy outline of a city behind those two figures, with a tree looking like a weapon. The tension between celebrating the mundane and lamenting the war was especially strong in Estonia. In Britain and France, victory could make up for it, or disguise, or at least mitigate the sense of loss. And everything was done to encourage this. In 1919, the British government commissioned William Orpen to do a painting in a memory of the Paris Peace Conference. Orpen, who disliked the military brass, refused to paint the unknown British soldier among the proud figures of allied generals in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Instead, he painted two emaciated, half-dead ordinary soldiers flanking the tomb of the unknown comrade. The Ministry of Information refused to exhibit the painting. Natalie Mei was never given a commission for a piece of troubled art. She made it. Her pictures were not banned from the military census, but forbidden by the moral one. Her prostitute scenes and distraught figures found no exhibition place until much later. National differences became particularly clear in the depiction of outrageous poverty or maimed soldiers and street women. Thousands of Estonian men had their faces blown off, or had missing limbs, or were horribly disfigured by mustard gas attacks. If in France, Britain, or Russia, those men often appeared in public events celebrating the victory and were shown in photographs to remind people of the suffering of common citizens, in Estonia such material is scarce, or it never happened there. There is a famous series of portraits by Natalie Mei of men, women, and children in army uniforms, but at the time, those were only used for illustration purposes to teach the new generations about the war. It was left to German artists to produce the most gruesome images of battlefield carnage, of the street violence and underground personages. A famous example is the series of etching made in 1923-24 by Otto Dix, entitled The War. Rotten corpses in waterlogged trenches, skulls filled with maggots and worms, faces which are barely recognizable as human. They are inspired by Goya's prints of wartime atrocities. Dix did those prints from memory. He had been a machine gunner on some of the worst battlefields, whereas Mei's drawings were initially only seen by her friends. In the best case, Dix's etchings were published as folios and widely shown. Even the technique of those artists tell the story. The drawings by Mei are in pastel colors in soft pencils, not so different in tone from the landscapes by genteel Estonian draughtsmen. The monochrome pictures by Dix are dark and aggressive as they are etched in fury. Many scholars had observed how the corrosive process involved in the etching technique, in which large holes can be bored in the plate by acid, mimics the expressive potential of Dix's subject matter. There is little like this in Mei or even Estonian art of the Neue Sachlichkeit. There are Estonian paintings of jubilant landscapes, like Konrad Magi, motif of Viljandi, in pictures of floating in mist, suspended houses by Estonian artists like Alexandra Krim's farmhouse of 1923, or the portrait of a young man of 1922. Or Jan Jachfra, anxiously looking self-portrait of 1923. Some are very good. Viljandi by Magi, for example, gives a vivid impression of joy, paying such monumental tribute to the rural Estonia, but the atmosphere, general atmosphere, is melancholic. Those artists, some of whom had never witnessed the same shocking scenes as Dix, lacked the ferocity of German artists. Mei, perhaps, is the least recognized in all her compatriots. Like so many artists of her generation all over Baltic in Nordic Europe, she was marked by the war forever. She was only 14 when the war started. But far from glorifying manly actions or wallowing in the gore, Mei related to the dead and the remaining live ones in an intimate and gently spiritual way. There is no rage in those pictures, just sadness and quiet irony, and a certain air of whimsy. While some characters look distressed, others in their anonymous clothes walk the Estonian streets and ponder in silence. The dead are recalled in a country at peace. What is missing in Mei's art, and what of most of her peers in Estonia, is the menacing air of violence. The German Jewish historian George Mosse, who escaped from Nazi persecution in Germany as a young man and later settled in America, argued that German life was brutalized by the militarism of World War I. People had become injured to death and cruelty. Men tested by the fire and steel of battle were exalted by nationalist writers such as Ernst Junger. War veterans felt emasculated, humiliated, and useless in peacetime. Only the camaraderie of collective violence would revive their spirits. Mosse wrote in his book, Fallen Soldiers, I quote, "War itself had been the great brutalizer, not merely through the experience of combat at the front, but also through the wartime relationships between officers and men and among them themselves." In other words, it was not so much war itself that brutalized German politics as much Barocca transition to peace. The humiliation of losing the war no doubt had something to do with this. It is harder for a defeated soldier to adapt to civilian life than the victorious ones. The German Empire was defeated and forced to sign an agreement with the Estonian Provisional Government on 19 of November 1918. The contempt for both Russians and Germans, both on the left and the right, was much greater in Estonia than in other parts of Europe. Certainly, the consequences of wartime defeat were more devastating in the country's dislocating economy, the moral collapse, and the harsh conditions in Estonian cities, where men and women would do anything to scrape by. No wonder that prostitution became one of the main symbols of Neue Sachlichkeit culture in Estonia, especially in the visual arts. Just a few decades earlier, a Norwegian artist, Christian Krohg, was working on the large painting called Albertine in the waiting room. Krohg was an educated man, read Hippolyte Taine, Zola, Baudelaire, but it was Taine's philosophy of art and the ideal of art that had a lasting impression on him, for like Taine, he believed in art's subjective reality of its time and place. Krohg wished to explore the prostitute's world outside bordellos. His piece invites us into the spectacle of Albertine impending examination, something he described as an awkward place where looks flicker from one face to another, some nervous, other desperate. It is a feature of embarrassment, and Krohg is ashamed of the very idea of it. He regarded such examinations as form of punishment, and saw waiting halls as dispatch rooms. May's visual representation of unfortunate and unjust class is linearly dense, capable of swerving and swooping at once. Whereas diluted representations of Les Miserables show the disintegration and reduction of May's drawing, the loss of seriousness and devolution into thin amusement. She explains many different types of misery from a wide range of vintage points. Unnecessary detachment in the case of a mother and child, I showed in the beginning. Injustice of a young boy, ostracizing, isolating female couple, exposure of a body and absence of its protection. What sort of visual imagery serves to document the life and appearance of the unfortunate for May? There is some powerful recording in her drawings, a set of very skillful sketches of her half-naked women and children who worked on the streets, in the cafes and casinos. The places May gives a particular importance and her utmost attention. War profiteers were a conspicuous presence in all the nations at war. They too found their way into paintings. But consider the difference between May's portrait of such a figure in the betrothal in Heinrich Maria Davrickhausen, the profiteer of 2021. Superficially, the two men look remarkably alike, well-fed, self-satisfied, thin-lipped, beady-eyed. But May's piece is ambiguous, slightly repellent, and sad at the same time. Davrickhausen's figure, sitting in a sterile, ultra-modern office with a smoldering cigar at his elbow and a glass of wine on his desk, is more frightening. Not quite the fat-necked brute you would see in the pictures by May or George Grosz, but still swinish enough. Grosz, graffiti-like caricatures of life in Weimar Germany express a kind of voluptuous loathing for the dislocated society of post-war Berlin. Men are either wrecked of war, begging in the streets, on crutches, ignored by well-dressed passers-by, or they are luxurious pigs, obese, cigar-chomping bosses, or uniformed thugs. Grosz wrote in 1922, quote, "People have created a rotten system, with a top in a bottom. A handful of them earn millions, while untold thousands have barely enough to exist on. My task is to show the oppressed the true faces of their masters. Man is not good, he is like cattle." Bertolt Brecht could not have expressed it better, and Natalie Mei could have said the same. What gives so many drawings by May their louche allure is that she revealed in the rottenness she professed to hate. The squalid streets of Tallinn, with their crippled envoys and pimps and plutocrats, provided the inspiration for her best art. The Estonian artist who was most clearly influenced by Grosz was the marvelous Edward Ole. He too loved drawing shady dancing hall, lesbian bars, hookers and other low-life characters, not just in Tallinn but in Europe. His art could be as lurid as Grosz Berlin pictures. But what is missing is the loathing. Ole doesn't hate. He's fascinated, amused, invigorated by the seamy vitality of urban life. May, together with such artists as Kuno Weber, who studied in the studio of Ants Laikmaa in Tallinn and was taught by Nikolai Triik, was part of the new objectivity movement, a nihilistic, slightly absurdist, somewhat realistic reaction to the supposedly rational world that produced the slaughter of World War I. originated in Germany just after the war. The term was coined by Gustav Friedrich Hartlaub, the director of the Kunsthalle in Mannheim. Sachlichkeit sprawled groups in Berlin, Central Germany, and even in Scandinavia, in Russia. But the true joy of it, the care with which the moment was made visible, feels also like May's testament. Thank you.
Thank you both for your talks. I think they really complemented each other quite nicely. And I think what I really liked about them was these kind of jumping between like this naturalism of Christian Krog and this Neue Sachlichkeit and making these kind of connections across and beyond, I think, our normal symbolist time frame and normal symbolist aesthetics that I think isn't done enough. I really appreciated that. And I think it made me, either starting first with this kind of 1920s new man, Bauhausian kind of figure, and working backwards, or the opposite, right? And starting in the 20s and as your main subject, but then tying it to these larger concerns, I think, again, I think reveals kind of the pivotal role that symbolism has in sort of bridging these modernist aesthetics, right, and ideas of humanity, and also the ways that they kind of maybe even conceal some of these kind of social critiques. But I wanted to ask Inessa, you had mentioned kind of this idea of violence being kind of somewhat absent in a lot of Estonian art in the early 20s. And I was wondering how you would relate May's own drawings and prints to like Edward Witold, for instance, if you were familiar, because just of the ways that he so depicts and contends with sexuality, or even some of the wartime prints or drawings in mixed media works by Nicolaus, that also kind of contend with some of these gendered issues in other kinds of ways that are maybe more expressionist rather than symbolist. But I'm not sure how familiar you are with them, but to me, they kind of popped up as kind of maybe points of comparison.
Yeah. I won't exactly put her work in a symbolist framework. She's really much more natural expressionist for me. And I would be also very careful to compare her with Trick, who seems to be very sort of mature, almost classical style. I think it would frighten her quite a bit. She was, of course, very young when she made those drawings, so she's, I think she's still quite naive to even think about violence, as violence. So it's very much as, that's why, I mean, they're also a very small scale. It's sort of, they're kind of, they're really quite illustration to the past, really. They're sort of illustration to history, which she inevitably wants to bring in the present. And that's a very slow process, of course, of adopting it, I think. There is absolutely no ready-made conclusion, I guess, in my size, because her career just went completely off from that. She's never came back to those very sort of painstaking, very extremely beautiful linear drawings and this very slow graphics. She became. I mean, she did illustrations, posters, features. Quite sparkling, vivid works, very much in color. She almost never came back to graphics, to black and white graphics. So, well, unless you would consider violence could be just the prerogative of the white and black and white sort of sphere, then she is quite comfortable in this world.
And then my second question was, how do you sort of position? I think one thing that you did is that you tied her so directly, or not directly, but you made a lot of allusions to these sort of pan-European, right, across time and space, these sort of recurring themes. And I was wondering how you maybe see it in terms of this sort of, right, because she is also, her sisters are also artists. And Kai Stahl has written quite a bit about this, about the Mei sisters and their significance. So I was wondering maybe how do you position yourself maybe in terms of her scholarship, since she's really kind of one of the few people who's kind of dealt with that.
Position where exactly in the...
Sort of, right, because in terms of, right, this kind of nascent feminism, maybe in his 20s and women's emancipation.
Well, you know, I haven't chosen Mei because she's a woman, you know, she's, it's for very different qualities. I've looked at her art. I hope she will find a place in this upcoming exhibition that Kumu stages at the end of this year, which is sort of emancipating, which finds its way in Estonian and Baltic art. I think it would be quite interesting. That probably would be the first sort of exposure really to the feminist world of Estonia, you know, in art. But she's at the time, she's not exactly the social figure. I only just begin to find all the traces sort of with people whom she communicated, and not go so far. I mean, she was very friendly with Eduard Wilde and his wife Linda. So that's probably was her first introduction to Estonian theater and literature circles. And but she's still quite shy, really. Also, coming from this rather provincial parts of Estonia and finding her way in, and possibly there is also a certain sisterhood competition in it, you know. So it's there is lots of dynamic happening in her, and I think she's quite vulnerable and susceptible and very fragile, but at the same time very much imperious also, you know, in her art.
Sure. She will certainly play a fundamental and pivotal role in the exhibition that's coming up soon, of course. But I wanted to also ask Irena maybe kind of the opposite, sort of same side of this question. I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking a lot about gender today, but just in terms of the idea of like marionettes and dolls being, right, not just these kind of blank figures, but also being controlled and manipulated, I think is really fascinating. I think you did a really great job of like probing, well, no pun intended, but probing some of these more like erotic psychological dimensions of that. And I wanted to, I wanted to ask, why did you find it important to kind of look at it retrospectively from the 20s instead of the opposite way, right? I mean, I asked because it was refreshing to look. That review was so refreshing. So I'm just wondering what was sort of your impetus for that.
Just to make it more interesting. No, I worked on symbolism for many years and on Wojtkiewicz among the others, and I wrote a small monograph on his art, and later on I switched to the interwar period and I worked on Bruno Schulz. And obviously there are many scholars who research his prose, and very few actually art historians who study his prints and drawings, and so there was some field to cover still, and actually I followed my biographical way of research. So when I was writing on Schulz, obviously I was trying to dig into his genealogy, artistic genealogy, which is linked to symbolism in many ways, and with the symbolist iconography as well. And indeed, that concept of a doll or a marionette is not, that obvious in Schultz's case, because this is a kind of a metaphor. He created more in his even more in his prose than in his drawings. And now when we try to interpret his drawings and prints, we usually use his prose to deepen the interpretation. So whereas in the case of Schultz, it's not that profound. These are dolls and mannequins. It was quite clear in the case of Wojtkiewicz. But I think that also taking into account those erotic undertones and the fact that both of them kind of tried to revise that pan-erotic philosophy and the irony then employed in their imagery, I thought that this connection is quite probable, reasonable. So this is why I connected these two artists, and that's it.
I think when you included the image by Wojtkiewicz in the corner of the spring image of the young sort of nude boy kind of in this awkward kind of pose against the spring landscape. I mean, this is like an iconic, for me at least, an iconic kind of work of Polish symbolism. And I was glad you brought it in because, of course, for me, it always creates immediate parallels with Janis Rosenthal's, oh my God, what is it called? The Jubilant Children. That is also in the exhibition. That Brasinda also brought up. Because stylistically they look so similar, right? They're both these children in these bucolic kind of landscapes, but what they are conveying are so radically different. And I was also thinking that there are certainly a lot of these melancholic children figures in the soul section, I guess, of the exhibition upstairs, right? But I also noticed that many of them, not all of them, but many of them come from the Polish-speaking artists working in in Vilnius. And of course, because of the Polish-speaking sort of dominance of artists there and their connections with, Młoda Polska and Young Poland, and I'm not really sure what I'm saying. I'm just sort of thinking out loud, I guess, about when things become melancholy, when they don't, right? Or maybe the sort of elasticity of these frameworks, and that artists can use these similar themes to such kind of surprisingly varying ends at the same time. I don't really know what my point is. Perhaps instead, since we have a good 13 minutes, I should open it up to the audience for questions, comments, concerns.
I was going to have a very short question to Inessa. You said then from your speech, it looked like that Natalie Mei have quite a lot of those drawings, but you showed only like 4 or 5. How many they are and where they are kept?
I don't know. If I would know the location and more, I would show more.
Many of them are downstairs.
Yes,
Here.
I am aware of that. Yes.
Other questions? We have lots of time to discuss.
Some of her, of course, some of her work for theatre were all at the Estonian Theatre Archive, and also some of her lectures and manuscripts and her diaries and so on, but they are hardly, I won't be able to use them for this presentation. So I am in search, yes.
What is your cutoff point? At what point do you say this is no longer symbolist, this is something else, this is constructivism or this is expressionism? So how does this relate to what follows symbolism in the post-World War I 20th century?
Well, it's easy to differentiate constructivism from symbolism on a morphological level, and also in terms of the goals of this art and artistic attitudes, but I think that actually symbolism never ends. We can consider it a historical trend, and then we can show the time frame for it, the chronological framework, and I would say that it reaches the 1930s. But as a stance, as an attitude, I think it lives till today, till the present. So I wouldn't try to make a very strictly defined borderline for its fading or dying or.
I think symbolism as an art movement went through very distinctive 3 stages. It didn't, I totally agree with Irena, it didn't necessarily died or faded or ceased to exist or forgotten, neglected or anything like that. I think it's became, maybe just at the eve of this First World War, it became a kind of a porous movement that absorbed so many different moods and anxieties and troubled and happy ideas, which in a way created this extraordinary firework, the really kaleidoscopic art historical landscape with all those new and German expressionism, and of course, the sort of rebirth of the national identity and the Russian avant-garde, and within, of course, again, so many different ways, and constructivism, and early modernism, etc. It's very cruel, I think, to put everything in chronological stages. Yes, I think art history is quite a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk in itself, and it's nice to perceive it as a very, very generous field.
Surely, it is historically situated. If it is only a stylistic or cognitive gesture of trying to see the transcendent in what is not quite a mimetic representation, then it has no dates whatsoever, and it's just a stylistic feature. If it's just like modernity, it has no end date, and it's with us all the time, and we're constantly running after it like a receding horizon. At the same time, this is situated historically in the decades around the turn of the century. So I would still, without wanting to be a technocratic chronologist, want to see what is specific about the historical moment and how it is different from what happened in the mid-19th century and how it is different from socialist realism, surrealism, postmodernism. And I'm just wondering do you feel, did anything change around 1930, which is the date that was chosen as the cutoff here for this conference?
I would also add that as long as artists look for some transcendental values and metaphysical qualities, and they're not interested and focused exclusively on the material surface of the world, we can speak of symbolism. And also I would consider that actually the expressionists, they also might be qualified as symbolists in a way. So the spiritual, I think, dimension of this art, or the effort to grasp the spiritual element of the world, is what distinguishes symbolism from many other historical art trends, and definitely not the morphology. These are not the stylistic. It is not a stylistic differentiation, because within the very broad, actually, historical symbolist movement, you have very many different stylistic, morphological, formal solutions. undertaken by the artists. So this is not the form itself, but this is the attitude towards the surrounding world and towards the inner world. I would say that this is the distinguishing feature.
I also, as the person who chose these dates in the title, conference title, I can explain, I guess, my own reasoning. One is that, I mean, I'm American in the United States. Quite many art historians, but not the American ones in this room, like very firmly believe in the idea that in 1905, you know, if we live in this Paris Franco-centric world, that Matisse did his thing at this, you know, autumn salon, and symbolism was dead, and Art Nouveau was dead, and that's when, you know, Fauvism comes, and then, you know, Cubism, and then suddenly, and that's just how it is. And in the United States, this idea is still very deeply ingrained, despite many of my colleagues' best efforts. But one of the reasons, for me, this is ridiculous, because of course, when you look at the dates of almost all of the works that are upstairs in the exhibition here, the overwhelming majority of them are made 1905 or after. So in that sense, do you just dismiss all of them because they fall outside of this date? Of course not. But the reason that it lasts so long is kind of twofold. When there was the Symbolism and Decadence exhibition at the Valdemarsudde in Stockholm, one of the most exciting things, at least for me, was that there were some works by Tira af Kleen and Gunnar Hallström, I think, that looked super turn of the century, but then their dates were actually like 1925, 1930, and I was totally shocked to see those dates. And that kind of encouraged me, at least, to, you know, why can't we be more flexible? Like, why are we so rigid with all these, you know, isms and styles if we're not doing it in an introductory kind of manner, on the one hand. On the second hand, also, with the Baltic Symbolism show, it was, so I have heard through the grapevine, also important for Rolf Rapetti to also sort of loosen, right, as a sort of renowned symbolism expert, to also loosen the boundaries of also what he thought symbolism was and could be, simply also for the same reason of looking at many of these drawings by Christian Raud and seeing that so many of them, that they seem very symbolist to him and to many of us, are the 20s and 30s. And I will also add the caveat that, of course, at least in Estonia, we don't really, well, I'm not Estonian, but symbolism is not really even used that often as a style. And a lot of these works fall under National Romanticism, which are not necessarily distinct phenomena. And I guess this national question we'll talk more about tomorrow, also with your own keynote lecture, but also with other topics. But I think I understand certainly the impulse to want a clear definition, undoubtedly. At the same time, I think symbolism is the most frustrating of all of the isms because it is the one that seeks to evade precisely that kind of clear definition the most. So, I agree. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Arguments for or against anything we just said? So we all agree on this fluid, symbolism never ended. Kind of like Impressionism never ended, and that's why you can buy, you know, these cute Impressionist paintings. Well, if there are no more other questions in the big public setting, then we can maybe go and break for coffee again, and tea and whatnot, and perhaps converse a little bit more intimately. Otherwise, thank you very much to our two last presenters in our Decadence and Degeneration panel. It was, very exciting stuff. Thanks.